Waitress refuses to serve black customer. Then his wife shows up. Rachel wiped down the counter at Diamond's Diner for what felt like the 100th time that morning, her movements automatic after years of the same routine. The familiar smell of coffee and bacon filled the air as early morning regulars shuffled in, most of them barely awake enough to grunt their orders. She knew them all by now: Bob with his black coffee and wheat toast, Maria who always wanted her eggs, just a little runny, and old Pete who'd been coming in since before Rachel started working there. Before we can continue, if you love your family, subscribe to this channel to help up creating amazing stories. Now, let's continue. The diner itself wasn't much to look at. Just your typical small-town joint with worn leather booths, slightly sticky menus, and a counter that had seen better days. But it had character, as people liked to say when they were trying to be nice about something old. The walls were covered with faded photos of the town from decades ago, and the ancient ceiling fan spun lazily overhead, doing more to move dust around than actually cool anyone down. Rachel had been working there so long she could probably do her job blindfolded. She knew exactly how many steps it took to get from the coffee maker to table 6, 12, which parts of the floor creaked, most of them, and which regular customers needed extra napkins without asking, at least half of them. Her co-workers often joked that she was more furniture than staff, just another permanent fixture in the diner's landscape. Some people called her efficient, others called her cold. Rachel didn't much care either way. She got her job done, didn't she? The food came out hot, the coffee stayed full, and the tables got cleared. That was what mattered, not whether she stopped to chat about someone's grandkids or their latest doctor's appointment. The morning rush was starting to pick up, the usual mix of construction workers grabbing breakfast before their shift and office folks stopping in for coffee. Rachel moved between tables with practiced ease, her notepad filled with shorthand only she could read. "Adam needs his hash browns extra crispy," she called out to Kenny in the kitchen, not bothering to look up as she refilled Mrs. Johnson's coffee cup. The bell above the door chimed constantly now, a steady stream of customers filing in and out. Rachel kept track of it all in her head: who needed refills, which orders were taking too long, who was probably ready for their check. It was like a dance she'd performed thousands of times before, each step automatic and precise. That's why she noticed immediately when something different happened. The bell chimed again around 10:30, but this time the usual buzz of conversation dimmed slightly. Rachel glanced up from where she was counting out change and saw him, a man who definitely wasn't a regular. He stuck out like a sore thumb in his crisp suit and shiny shoes, looking more like he belonged in one of those fancy cafes downtown than in Diamonds with its sticky syrup dispensers and slightly wobbly tables. Rachel felt her jaw tighten without really knowing why. Maybe it was the way he stood there looking around like he was inspecting the place, or maybe it was just that he was throwing off her routine. Whatever it was, she already knew she didn't like it. She took her time getting to him, making sure to top off every coffee cup along the way. Let him wait. Maybe he'd realize this wasn't his kind of place and head somewhere else. But he didn't. He just stood there patiently, occasionally checking his phone but otherwise seeming content to wait his turn. The morning light streaming through the windows caught on his watch, making it glint. Rachel bet it cost more than she made in a month. She'd seen his type before. Businessmen who wandered in thinking they were doing the common folk a favor by gracing them with their presence. They usually left disappointed when they realized Diamonds didn't serve fancy lattes or avocado toast. "Table 3 needs more napkins," she muttered to herself, deliberately walking past the man to attend to other customers. She could feel his eyes following her, probably wondering why she hadn't taken his order yet. Good. Let him wonder. The usual sounds of the diner continued around them: the sizzle of bacon on the grill, the clinking of coffee cups, the murmur of conversation, and Kenny singing off-key in the kitchen. Rachel moved through it all with practiced efficiency, her shoes squeaking slightly on the linoleum floor as she delivered plates and cleared tables. She couldn't avoid him forever, though, much as she wanted to. After what seemed like a reasonable amount of time, to her anyway, she finally made her way over to where he stood. She didn't bother with her fake customer service smile. He'd probably see right through it anyway. The man didn't seem bothered by the wait. He smiled at her, all perfect white teeth and expensive haircut. "Good morning," he said, his voice pleasant and warm. Rachel just nodded, pulling out her order pad with more force than necessary. The corner caught on her apron pocket, tearing it slightly.
Great.
Another thing to fix. Coffee, he said, still smiling. And the breakfast platter, if you don't mind. Eggs over easy, please. He spoke like someone used to being listened to, someone who probably had people jumping to do his bidding all day long. Well, not here. Not with her. Rachel scribbled down his order, without looking at him, her handwriting messier than usual. She didn't bother repeating it back to him. If he wanted something specific, he should have said so the first time. Without a word, she turned and walked away, leaving him standing there with his mouth half open like he wanted to say something else. The order ticket joined the others on Kenny's wheel, though she might have slapped it down a bit harder than necessary. Kenny raised an eyebrow at her, but knew better than to comment. He'd worked with Rachel long enough to know when to keep his mouth shut. "Order in," she called out, more out of habit than anything else. She could hear the man's expensive shoes clicking against the floor as he made his way to an empty booth. He sat down carefully, like he was afraid of getting his suit dirty. Rachel rolled her eyes. If he was that concerned about his clothes, he should have gone to one of those overpriced breakfast places downtown. The morning continued its usual rhythm around them, but Rachel felt off balance now. It was like having a puzzle piece that didn't quite fit. Everything looked normal on the surface, but something was just slightly wrong. She found herself glancing over at his booth more often than she wanted to, watching as he sat there looking perfectly calm and composed, like he had all the time in the world. It irritated her more than it should have. Who did he think he was, coming in here with his fancy suit and his perfect manners, acting like he belonged? This was her diner. Well, not literally hers, but she'd been here long enough that it felt like it. She knew every crack in the ceiling, every wobble in the tables, every regular customer's story. He was an outsider, plain and simple, and she didn't like outsiders disrupting her routine. Jonathan sat at his booth, trying to look comfortable despite feeling anything but. He'd chosen Diamond's Diner on purpose. It was close to his new office, and he'd always preferred these kinds of places to the stuffy cafes his colleagues frequented. There was something honest about a place like this, with its slightly scratched tables and handwritten specials board. At least, that's what he'd thought before walking in. The coffee cup in front of him was barely half full and lukewarm at best. He took another sip anyway, wondering if he'd somehow offended the waitress without realizing it. Maybe he should have waited to be seated instead of approaching the counter. Or maybe his suit was too much. He'd come straight from an early morning meeting, not really thinking about how out of place he might look. The waitress, Rachel, according to her name tag, moved around the diner like she owned the place. She seemed to have a sixth sense for when other customers needed refills or wanted to order, but somehow that sense conveniently failed whenever she passed by his table. He watched as she chatted with an elderly couple a few booths down, her voice carrying just enough for him to hear her joking about the weather. So she could be friendly when she wanted to be. Jonathan checked his watch, trying not to be obvious about it. He had plenty of time before his next meeting, but the gesture was automatic. The movement caught Rachel's eye, and he saw her lips tighten slightly.
Great.
Now, she probably thought he was being impatient. "Excuse me," he called out softly as she passed by his table for the third time without acknowledging him. "Would it be possible to get this warmed up?" He lifted his coffee cup slightly, keeping his voice polite and friendly. Rachel stopped, but didn't turn to face him fully. "It's what we have right now," she said, her tone making it clear that this conversation was over before it began. She started to walk away, then paused. "Kitchen's backed up. Your food will be ready when it's ready." Jonathan hadn't asked about his food, but he just nodded. "Thank you," he said to her, retreating back. He noticed a few other customers glancing his way, some with sympathy, others quickly looking away when they caught his eye. He felt his face growing warm, that uncomfortable feeling you get when you know you're being treated unfairly, but can't quite figure out why. The diner's atmosphere suddenly felt heavier, more oppressive. The cheerful chatter around him seemed to highlight his isolation rather than welcome him. He could hear Rachel's voice as she took orders at other tables, her tone notably warmer, almost friendly. The contrast with how she spoke to him was stark. He considered leaving. There were plenty of other places nearby where he could get breakfast. But something made him stay put. Maybe it was stubbornness, or maybe it was the principle of the thing. He hadn't done anything wrong, after all. He'd been polite, patient, and understanding. If Rachel had a problem with him, that was on her, not him. The minutes ticked by slowly. Jonathan pulled out his phone, trying to look busy rather than uncomfortable. He scrolled through his emails without really reading them, aware of Rachel's occasional glances in his direction. Each time she passed his table, her steps seemed to quicken slightly, like she couldn't bear to be near him any longer than absolutely necessary. Other customers came and went. He watched as people who had arrived after him received their food, ate, and left, while his own order remained mysteriously delayed. The elderly couple he'd seen Rachel joking with earlier gave him a sympathetic look as they passed his booth on their way out. The woman even paused, looking like she wanted to say something, but her husband gently tugged her along. The coffee in his cup had gone completely cold now. Jonathan ran his finger along the rim, noticing the slight chip in the ceramic. Everything in the diner showed signs of wear and use. The scratched tables, the worn menus, the faded photographs on the walls. But there was usually a charm to places like this, a sense of history and community. Right now, though, he just felt like an unwelcome intruder. He caught snippets of conversation from nearby tables. Two construction workers discussing their latest project. A young mother trying to convince her toddler to eat something besides syrup. An older man reading his newspaper aloud to his wife, who nodded along even though she seemed more interested in her pancakes. Normal, everyday scenes that made him feel even more out of place. Rachel appeared again, this time carrying plates piled high with food to a table that had definitely ordered after him. She didn't even glance his way as she distributed the plates with practiced ease. "Need anything else?" he heard her ask them, her voice warm and friendly. "More coffee? Extra butter for those pancakes." Jonathan felt something twist in his stomach. It wasn't just that she was being cold to him. She was going out of her way to show him how differently she treated other customers. He'd dealt with prejudice before, but usually it was more subtle than this. Usually, people at least tried to hide their biases behind fake smiles and polite excuses. He considered asking to speak to a manager, but the thought made him uncomfortable. He'd never been one to make a scene or complain about service. Besides, what would he say? That the waitress didn't smile enough? That his coffee was cold? That she seemed to be deliberately ignoring him? It all sounded petty when he thought about putting it into words, even though the experience felt anything but petty while living through it. The bell above the door chimed again, and Jonathan looked up automatically. His heart lifted as he recognized the familiar figure stepping into the diner. Monica's presence always had that effect on him, like sunshine breaking through clouds. She spotted him immediately, her expression changing as she took in his posture and the untouched place setting in front of him. He watched as his wife's eyes scanned the diner, taking in every detail with the sharp observation skills that made her such an effective lawyer. Her gaze lingered on Rachel for a moment, and Jonathan could tell she was already putting the pieces together. Monica had always been better at confronting these situations head-on. Where he tended to avoid conflict, she believed in addressing problems directly. As she made her way to his booth, Jonathan felt some of his tension ease. Whatever happened next, at least he wasn't alone anymore. Monica's hand squeezed his shoulder as she slid into the seat across from him, her eyes asking silent questions. He gave her a small smile, but he could tell by her expression that it wasn't very convincing. Monica's entrance changed the energy in the diner immediately. She carried herself with the kind of confidence that came from years of commanding courtroom attention, though she wore it more casually today in her weekend clothes. A few heads turned as she walked in, but she only had eyes for Jonathan. The moment she saw him sitting there with an empty place setting and a cold cup of coffee, her expression shifted from warm to concerned. The squeeze she gave his shoulder as she sat down spoke volumes. They'd been married long enough that they could have entire conversations without saying a word. Right now, his slightly hunched posture and forced smile told her everything she needed to know. Something was wrong, and knowing Jonathan, he'd been sitting here quietly dealing with it rather than making a fuss. "Hey, honey," she said softly, sliding into the booth across from him. "Thought I'd surprise you with breakfast before your meeting." She glanced at his empty table, then at her watch. "How long have you been waiting?" Jonathan shrugged, trying to play it off. "Not too long. They're just busy, I guess." But his eyes flickered toward Rachel, who was cheerfully chatting with customers at another table, and Monica caught the look. 20 years of reading witnesses in court had made her pretty good at spotting when someone was holding something back. She watched Rachel for a moment, noting how the waitress's whole demeanor changed when she glanced their way. The smile dropped from her face, replaced by something harder, almost hostile. Monica had seen that look before. It was the same one she'd faced early in her career, when she'd walk into a room full of male lawyers who didn't think she belonged there. "Jonathan," she said quietly, reaching across the table to touch his hand. "How long have you really been waiting?" She kept her voice gentle, but she could feel a familiar fire starting to burn in her chest. The same one that got her through law school when professors suggested she'd be better off teaching instead of practicing law. He sighed, knowing better than to try hiding anything from her. "About 45 minutes. The coffee's cold, and I'm pretty sure my order got lost somewhere between here and the kitchen." He tried to smile again, but it didn't reach his eyes. "It's fine, really. We can go somewhere else." But Monica was already shaking her head. She'd spent too many years fighting against this kind of treatment to walk away now. Besides, she knew Jonathan would never complain on his own behalf. He'd sit there all day with cold coffee and an empty stomach before he'd make a scene. It was one of the things she loved about him, his patience, his willingness to give people the benefit of the doubt. But sometimes, she knew, patience wasn't the answer. Rachel was wiping down a nearby table, deliberately keeping her back to their booth. Monica watched her movements, noting how she seemed to be taking an unusually long time with a simple task. Other customers were trying to catch Rachel's eye for refills or their checks, but she appeared completely absorbed in her cleaning. "I'm going to talk to her," Monica said, her tone making it clear this wasn't up for discussion. Jonathan reached across the table, catching her wrist gently. "Monica, please. It's not worth making a scene over." His voice was low, worried. He hated confrontation, always had. It was why they worked so well together. She fought the battles he wouldn't fight for himself. "It's always worth it," she replied, but squeezed his hand reassuringly. "Trust me, I'll be polite." She slid out of the booth before he could protest further, smoothing down her shirt out of habit. Years of courtroom appearances had made the gesture automatic. As she approached the counter, Monica could feel Rachel's reluctance to acknowledge her. The waitress kept wiping the same spot on the table, her movements becoming more aggressive with each stroke. A few other customers were watching now, probably sensing the tension in the air. "Excuse me," Monica said, keeping her voice pleasant but firm. The same tone she used when facing a difficult witness, professional, controlled, but with an edge of steel underneath. Rachel finally turned around, her face set in a mask of forced politeness. "Yes." The single word carried enough frost to chill the whole diner. Rachel's eyes met Monica's briefly before sliding away, focusing on something just past her shoulder. Monica maintained her composure, though she could feel her jaw tightening. "I couldn't help but notice my husband has been waiting quite a while for his breakfast. I was wondering if there might be a problem with the kitchen." Rachel's expression didn't change, but her knuckles whitened where she gripped her cleaning rag. "Like I told him, we're busy. Orders come out when they come out." She started to turn away, clearly considering the conversation over. "I see," Monica said, her voice carrying just enough to make Rachel pause. "And I assume all customers wait 45 minutes for cold coffee, or is that special treatment reserved for certain people?" The diner had grown quieter now, the usual breakfast chatter dying down as people tried to pretend they weren't listening. Rachel turned back slowly, something flickering in her eyes. Anger, maybe, or embarrassment. For a moment, they just looked at each other. Two women who'd probably faced their own share of prejudice, now standing on opposite sides of the same issue. Monica could see Jonathan from the corner of her eye, looking uncomfortable but supportive. She knew he'd rather leave than deal with this confrontation, but sometimes the hard conversations were the necessary ones. Sometimes you had to stand your ground, even over something as simple as a cup of coffee and a delayed breakfast order. The tension stretched between them like a rubber band pulled too tight. Rachel's face had flushed slightly, but she kept her chin up, defiant. Monica recognized that look too, the stubborn pride that sometimes made people double down on their mistakes rather than admit they were wrong. Well, she'd faced tougher opponents in court. This wasn't about winning an argument. It was about addressing an injustice, no matter how small it might seem. "I think," Monica said carefully, "we both know what's really going on here, and I think you're better than this." She kept her voice low enough that only Rachel could hear her, giving her the dignity of a private conversation despite the public setting. Something shifted in Rachel's expression then, just a flicker, but Monica caught it. Sometimes that's all it took, a moment of recognition, a chance to step back and see her own actions through someone else's eyes. Monica took a deep breath, years of courtroom experience helping her maintain her composure. The diner had grown so quiet you could hear the buzz of the fluorescent lights overhead and the steady drip of the coffee maker in the corner. She could feel eyes on them, but she kept her focus on Rachel, who stood rigid behind the counter. "I'm not trying to cause trouble," Monica said, keeping her voice steady. "But I've spent my whole career watching people get treated differently because of how they look or what they wear. And I've learned that staying quiet about it only makes things worse." Rachel's fingers drummed against the counter, a nervous habit she probably wasn't even aware of. "I don't know what you're talking about," she said, but her voice lacked its earlier edge. "We're just busy, that's all. Everyone has to wait their turn." "Really?" Monica glanced pointedly at a couple who had walked in after Jonathan but were already halfway through their meals. "Because it seems like some people's turns come faster than others." A muscle twitched in Rachel's jaw. She grabbed a coffee pot, probably more for something to do with her hands than any real purpose. "Look, if you've got a complaint, you can talk to management. I've got other customers to serve." But Monica didn't move. "I could do that," she agreed. "I could file a formal complaint. I could make a scene. I could even call my law firm and discuss whether this qualifies as discriminatory service." She paused, watching Rachel's face pale slightly. "But I don't think that's necessary, do you?" The coffee pot shook slightly in Rachel's hand. Around them, other customers pretended to focus on their meals, but Monica could tell they were hanging on every word. Jonathan sat quietly in his booth, his expression a mix of pride and concern. "I didn't." Rachel started, then stopped. She set the coffee pot down harder than necessary, making the liquid slosh inside. "You don't understand. This is my place. I've been here for years. I know everyone, I know how things work. And my husband doesn't belong here?" Monica asked quietly. "Because he's wearing a suit? Because he looks different from your usual customers?" Rachel's face flushed. "That's not. I didn't mean..." She fumbled with her order pad, dropping it on the counter. Papers scattered, and she scrambled to gather them up, her movements jerky and uncertain. "Let me tell you something about my husband," Monica continued, her voice softening. "He chose this diner because he likes places like this. Real places with real people. He grew up in a neighborhood not too different from this one. That suit he's wearing? He bought it secondhand and had it tailored because he had 3 job interviews this week. He's not some stuck-up businessman looking down on your diner. He's just a guy trying to get breakfast." Rachel stood frozen, the scattered order slips forgotten in her hands. Around them, the usual diner sounds began to creep back in, the clinking of cutlery, the murmur of conversations resuming, the sizzle from the kitchen. But between them, the tension remained thick and heavy. Rachel swallowed hard. "I didn't know." "You couldn't have," Monica agreed, "because you decided who he was the moment he walked in. You didn't bother to find out anything about him. You just saw what you wanted to see." Rachel's shoulders slumped slightly. She glanced over at Jonathan, who was studying his cold coffee with intense concentration, clearly trying to give them privacy despite being the subject of their conversation. Something in his posture, the slight hunch of his shoulders, the careful way he held himself, seemed to finally register with her. "I'll get him fresh coffee," she said quietly, "and I'll check on his order." Monica nodded, but didn't move from the counter. "Thank you. But you know this isn't just about coffee and breakfast, don't you?" Rachel's hands twisted her apron. "I'm not. I don't usually..." She stopped, took a breath.
I'm sorry.
You're right. I made assumptions, and that wasn't fair. No, it wasn't, Monica agreed. But you know what? The fact that you can admit, that means there's hope. She smiled slightly, some of the tension easing from her shoulders. Sometimes we all need someone to hold up a mirror and make us really look at ourselves. Rachel nodded slowly, then turned to get a fresh pot of coffee. Her movements were different now, less aggressive, more thoughtful. She filled a clean cup with hot coffee and, after a moment's hesitation, grabbed a slice of pie from the display case. "It's on the house," she said, carrying both to Jonathan's table. Her voice was quiet but clear. "I'm sorry about the wait. Your breakfast will be out in 5 minutes. I'll make sure of it." Monica watched as Jonathan accepted the peace offering with a gentle smile, thanking Rachel as if the last hour hadn't happened. That was just like him, always ready to forgive, to move forward. She made her way back to the booth, sliding in across from him. The diner gradually returned to its normal rhythm, but something had shifted. Rachel moved through her tasks with a new awareness, her interactions with customers more genuine, less automatic. Every now and then, she'd glance their way, her expression thoughtful. "You didn't have to do that," Jonathan said softly, reaching across the table to squeeze Monica's hand. "Yes, I did," she replied, watching as Rachel delivered their breakfast with careful attention. Sometimes the small battles are just as important as the big ones. The food was hot, perfectly cooked, and served with a sincerity that meant more than any grand gesture could have. Sometimes, Monica thought, that's how change happens, not with dramatic speeches or legal action, but with quiet conversations and the courage to acknowledge when we've been wrong. The breakfast plate sat empty between Monica and Jonathan, the last bits of syrup soaked up with a final piece of toast. The morning rush had slowed to a trickle, leaving the diner in that quiet lull between breakfast and lunch. Most of the tables had cleared out, save for a few regulars nursing their coffee cups. That's when Mrs. Henderson made her way over to their booth. She was a tiny woman with silver hair and kind eyes, the type who probably had a purse full of hard candies and pictures of her grandkids. She'd been watching the earlier confrontation from her usual corner spot, her hands wrapped around a mug of tea that had long gone cold. "I hope you don't mind me interrupting," she said, her voice gentle but firm. "But I wanted to thank you." She looked directly at Monica, years of wisdom evident in her gaze. Someone needed to say something, and I'm ashamed to admit I never did. Monica gestured to the empty seat beside her, and Mrs. Henderson settled in with a grateful smile. "I've been coming here for 15 years, she continued, smoothing her skirt with weathered hands. "Every Tuesday and Friday, same time, same order. And I've seen it happen before." Jonathan leaned forward slightly, his empty coffee cup forgotten. "You mean with Rachel?" Mrs. Henderson nodded slowly. "She's not a bad person, mind you. Most days, she's perfectly pleasant. But I've noticed patterns. The way she treats certain customers differently. Sometimes it's people in business clothes, sometimes it's young folks with their fancy phones and laptops. Once it was a group of college students who came in after a formal event, all dressed up." She paused, fiddling with a napkin dispenser. "I told myself it wasn't my place to say anything, that maybe I was reading too much into things. But watching what happened this morning," she shook her head. "Well, it made me realize that staying quiet is its own kind of problem." From across the diner, they could see Rachel working, her movements more subdued than before. She was taking an order from a new customer, and they could see her making a conscious effort to maintain eye contact, to really listen. "The thing about small towns," Mrs. Henderson continued, "is that we get set in our ways. We decide who belongs and who doesn't, and sometimes we don't even realize we're doing it. Rachel's been here so long, she probably thinks she's protecting the place, keeping it authentic, or some such nonsense." Monica watched as Rachel delivered another order, noting how the waitress paused to actually chat with a customer, asking how they wanted their eggs cooked instead of just scribbling down the order and walking away. It was a small change, but a noticeable one. "Change isn't easy," Mrs. Henderson said, following Monica's gaze. "Especially when you don't realize you need to change. Sometimes it takes someone holding up a mirror, making you see yourself the way others see you." Jonathan shifted in his seat, looking uncomfortable with the attention. I don't want to cause any trouble for her. Maybe we should just let it go. But Mrs. Henderson shook her head firmly.
No, dear.
Sometimes trouble is exactly what we need. A little shake-up to make us question our habits. She patted his hand. Besides, I've seen how she's been since your wife spoke up. She's thinking about things now, and that's always the first step. The manager had emerged from his office, probably drawn by the earlier commotion. He was a middle-aged man with worry lines around his eyes, the kind of person who looked like he'd spent years mediating small disputes and balancing books. He watched Rachel work for a moment, then made his way over to their booth. I couldn't help but overhear what happened earlier, he said, his voice low and apologetic. I want you to know that this isn't what we stand for here at Diamonds. Monica nodded, keeping her voice equally quiet. I believe you. And I think what matters now is how we move forward. The manager ran a hand through his thinning hair. I've known Rachel for years. She's one of our hardest workers. But this isn't the first time. He trailed off, looking troubled. Maybe I should have addressed it sooner. It's never too late to start, Mrs. Henderson chimed in. And sometimes these moments, uncomfortable as they are, give us all a chance to grow. They could see Rachel watching them from the corner of her eye as she restocked the sugar dispensers. Her face was flushed, but there was something different in her expression now, less defensive, more thoughtful. The manager's presence clearly made her nervous, but she kept working, her movements careful and deliberate. I'll be having a talk with her, the manager said. Not to punish, but to help her understand. We're a community place. That means everyone should feel welcome here. Monica touched Jonathan's hand across the table. That's all we want. Not to cause trouble, but to make things better. Mrs. Henderson smiled, the wrinkles around her eyes deepening. You know, sometimes it takes an outsider to help us see what we've gotten too comfortable to notice. Like when my granddaughter pointed out that I always locked my car doors when certain people walked by. Didn't even realize I was doing it until she said something. The diner had started to fill up again with the early lunch crowd. Rachel moved between tables with the same efficiency as before, but there was a new awareness to her actions. She smiled more genuinely, listened more carefully, treated each customer as an individual rather than a category. Look at that, Mrs. Henderson said softly. Sometimes all it takes is a moment of truth to start changing things. Mind you, it won't happen overnight. Old habits die hard, as they say. But at least now she's aware, and that's half the battle right there. Rachel sat in her small apartment that evening, still wearing her work uniform, too tired to change. The events of the day played over and over in her mind like a movie she couldn't turn off. Her tiny kitchen felt even smaller than usual, the walls seeming to close in as she nursed a cup of tea that had gone cold hours ago. Her phone buzzed again, probably Kelly from work, wanting to know what happened after her shift ended. Word had spread quickly through the diner staff about the morning's confrontation. Rachel ignored the message, just like she'd ignored the others. She wasn't ready to talk about it yet, wasn't ready to admit how the day's events had shaken her. The meeting with her manager kept replaying in her head. She'd sat in his cramped office after her shift, the ancient ceiling fan clicking above them, while he talked about customer service and discrimination policies. But it wasn't his words that got to her. It was the disappointment in his eyes. Mike had given her her first job, trusted her with keys to the diner, defended her when customers complained about her being too brusque. Rachel, he'd said, his voice tired and kind at the same time, you've been here longer than almost anyone. Your family. That's why this hurts so much. She tried to defend herself at first, falling back on the usual excuses. They were busy. The kitchen was backed up. She treated everyone the same. But even as the words left her mouth, they felt hollow, false. The truth was right there, staring her in the face, and for the first time, she couldn't look away from it. Mike had pulled out a folder, customer complaints she didn't know existed. Not many, but enough to show a pattern she'd been too stubborn to see. Different customers, different days, but similar stories. A businessman made to wait an hour for a simple order. A group of well-dressed women who never got their water refilled. A young guy with a laptop who finally left without being served. "I should have addressed this sooner," Mike had said, looking more tired than she'd ever seen him. "That's on me. But now we have to deal with it, Rachel. We have to make this right." She'd sat there, her hands twisted in her apron, as he laid out her options. A formal warning would go in her file. She'd need to attend sensitivity training, the same kind they made new hires go through, only this time with special attention to unconscious bias. And she'd be on probation for the next 3 months. "If it happens again," he'd said gently, "I won't have a choice. You understand that, right?" Now, sitting in her dark kitchen, Rachel finally picked up her phone. 3 messages from Kelly, one from Mike checking if she'd gotten home okay, and an email confirming her sensitivity training next week. Her thumb hovered over Kelly's messages before finally opening them. "You okay? Heard what happened. Want to grab a drink after work? Rachel, come on. Talk to me." She started typing, deleted it, started again. How could she explain something she was only just beginning to understand herself? A car alarm went off somewhere down the street, making Rachel jump. She got up to look out her window, more for something to do than actual curiosity. The street below was quiet except for Mr. Rodriguez closing up his corner store. He waved up at her like he did every night, and she waved back automatically. The irony wasn't lost on her. Here she was, exchanging friendly waves with her immigrant neighbor, while just hours ago she'd been treating a stranger badly because of how he looked. What did that say about her? What did it say about the lines she drew between us and them? Her phone buzzed again. Kelly wasn't giving up. "Look, I know you're reading these. Just let me know you're okay." Rachel sighed and finally replied, "I'm home. Just thinking." The response came immediately. "Want company? I've got ice cream." 20 minutes later, Kelly was at her door with a pint of mint chocolate chip and a concerned expression. She didn't say anything at first, just walked in and grabbed 2 spoons from the drawer like she'd done 100 times before. "So," Kelly said, settling onto Rachel's worn couch. "Want to talk about it?" Rachel poked at her ice cream, watching it melt around the edges. "I might lose my job." "Mike wouldn't fire you. You've been there forever." "He will if it happens again." Rachel looked up at her friend. "And the thing is, I'm not sure I can promise it won't." Kelly was quiet for a moment, letting that sink in. "Because you don't think you did anything wrong?" "No," Rachel said slowly, surprising herself with the honesty. "Because I didn't even realize I was doing it." How do you stop something you don't notice you're doing? The ice cream sat forgotten between them as Rachel finally let everything pour out. The confrontation with Monica, Mrs. Henderson's words, Mike's disappointment. Kelly listened without interrupting, something she wasn't usually good at. "You know what the worst part is?" Rachel said finally. "I've been on the other side of this. Remember when we went to that fancy restaurant downtown for your birthday? The one where the hostess acted like we couldn't possibly afford to eat there?" Kelly nodded. "You were mad about that for weeks." "Yeah, well, looks like I'm not so different." Rachel let out a bitter laugh. "God, I've become exactly what I hate." "Hey," Kelly said softly. "The fact that you're sitting here beating yourself up about it means you're not the same. You're learning. That's more than a lot of people do." Rachel picked up her spoon again, more for something to fidget with than any desire to eat. "Mike says I have to do sensitivity training." "Me?" "After 8 years of working there." "Maybe that's not such a bad thing," Kelly suggested carefully. "Sometimes we all need a refresher course in being human, you know?" Outside, another car alarm started up, then quickly silenced. The normal sounds of the city at night filtered through the thin walls, distant sirens, the rumble of the elevated train, someone's music playing too loud. Life going on as usual, even while Rachel's world felt tilted on its axis. "I keep thinking about what his wife said," Rachel admitted. "About how he chose our diner, because he likes places like that. Real places." She shook her head. "I made him feel like he didn't belong in the one place he wanted to be." "How messed up is that?" Kelly reached over and squeezed her hand. "Pretty messed up. But, you know what? Tomorrow's another day. You get to choose who you want to be, starting right now." Rachel nodded slowly, finally taking a bite of the now soupy ice cream. It wasn't that simple, she knew. Old habits didn't disappear overnight, and biases ran deeper than she'd realized. But maybe acknowledging them was the first step. Maybe being uncomfortable, feeling this shame and regret, was part of the process. "I have to do better," she said quietly. "I have to be better." "You will be," Kelly assured her. "And hey, I'll help. Next time I see you giving someone the cold shoulder, I'll dump a coffee pee. OT over your head." Rachel managed a small laugh, the first one since that morning. It wasn't much, but it was a start. Tomorrow she'd go back to the diner, put on her apron, and try again. That's all anyone could do, really. Keep trying, keep learning, keep growing. The weeks after the incident brought subtle but noticeable changes to Diamond's diner. Rachel stood behind the counter early one morning, watching the sunrise paint the sky in shades of pink and orange through the slightly streaky windows. She'd started coming in earlier, using the quiet time before opening to think, to prepare herself for the day ahead. The sensitivity training had been uncomfortable, sure, but it had also opened her eyes to things she'd never noticed before, like how she automatically smiled at some customers but not others, or how she'd make assumptions about tips based on how people dressed. Small things, really, but they added up to something bigger. The bell above the door chimed as the first customer of the day walked in. Rachel looked up, consciously pushing aside her initial reaction to the man's expensive suit and shiny briefcase. "Good morning," she said, meaning it this time. "Coffee's fresh if you'd like some." He seemed surprised by her warmth, and Rachel felt a twinge of shame, wondering how many others had expected coldness from her. She poured his coffee with care, asked how he took it, and actually listened to his response. These small interactions, she'd learned, were where change really happened. The morning rush started picking up, familiar faces mixed with new ones. Mrs. Johnson with her crossword puzzle, Bob and his newspaper, the college kids with their laptops. Rachel moved between tables with practiced efficiency, but there was a new awareness to her actions now. "How's the studying going?" she asked one of the college students, remembering that he'd mentioned finals week. He looked up, startled that she'd remembered, then launched into an explanation of his thesis project. She listened while refilling his coffee, offering a genuine good luck before moving on. Kelly caught her eye from across the diner, giving her a subtle thumbs up. They developed a system over the past few weeks, little signals when Rachel started falling back into old habits. But those moments were becoming rarer, the conscious effort slowly turning into natural behavior. The sensitivity training instructor had talked about something called automatic thoughts, those instant reactions we have before we can catch ourselves. Rachel had learned she couldn't always control those first thoughts, but she could control what she did with them. So when a group of businessmen in expensive suits walked in, she acknowledged her initial surge of irritation, then deliberately set it aside. Around mid-morning, Rachel spotted a familiar face at the door. Monica and Jonathan walked in, and Rachel felt her heart skip a beat. She hadn't seen them since that day, though she'd thought about them often. They looked surprised to see her, probably assuming she'd been fired. Taking a deep breath, Rachel approached their table. "Good morning," she said, her voice steady despite her nerves. "It's good to see you both again." The surprise on their faces shifted to something warmer as they noticed the genuine welcome in her tone. Jonathan ordered coffee. "Hot this time, please," he joked gently, and Rachel found herself laughing along, the tension easing. As she brought their drinks, she noticed Monica watching her interactions with other customers. Rachel knew what she was seeing. The careful attention she now paid to each person, the way she caught herself when old habits tried to surface. It wasn't perfect, but it was progress. "Your coffee's fresh," Rachel said, setting down their cups. She hesitated, then added, "And I want to thank you, both of you. What happened that day, well, it needed to happen." Monica's expression softened. "Change isn't easy," she said, "but recognizing the need for it is half the battle." Rachel nodded, thinking of all the small moments over the past few weeks. The young programmer who now felt comfortable enough to work from the diner, setting up his laptop without worrying about feeling out of place. The group of business students who'd become regulars, filling a corner booth with their textbooks and study guides. Even Mr. Chin, who'd started bringing his whole family in for Sunday breakfast instead of just grabbing a quick coffee to go. The funny thing is, Rachel said, more to herself than to them, the diner feels more like home now than it did before. More like what it was always supposed to be. As if to prove her point, the bell chimed again. A mixed group walked in, some in suits, some in work clothes, a woman with purple hair and multiple piercings. The old Rachel would have made snap judgments about each of them. The new Rachel just saw customers, people looking for a good meal, and maybe a friendly face. "Would you like to hear about our specials?" she asked Monica and Jonathan, pulling out her order pad with a smile that reached her eyes. The morning continued, sunlight streaming through the windows, the smell of coffee and bacon filling the air. Rachel moved between tables, pouring coffee, taking orders, making small talk. But now each interaction felt real, meaningful in a way it hadn't before. She caught glimpses of her reflection in the diner's windows throughout the day. The same uniform, the same name tag, but something was different. Maybe it was the way she held herself, or the genuine smile that came more easily now. Or maybe it was just that she finally saw herself clearly and didn't mind what she saw. The diner had changed too, in subtle ways. The atmosphere was warmer, more welcoming. People lingered over their meals, chatting with neighbors at other tables. The walls between regulars and outsiders had started to blur, creating something that felt more like a true community. When Monica and Jonathan left, they both thanked her warmly. "We'll be back," Monica said, and Rachel knew she meant it. More importantly, she knew they'd be welcome, truly welcome when they did. 6 months after the incident, Diamond's Diner had become something different. Not in its appearance. The same worn booths still squeaked, the same ancient ceiling fans still spun lazily overhead, and the same slightly sticky menus sat in their holders. But there was a change in the air, something you couldn't quite see but could definitely feel. Rachel stood at her usual spot behind the counter one busy morning, watching the diverse crowd that now filled the diner. The businessman in the corner shared his newspaper with the construction worker at the next table. A group of college students had pushed 2 tables together with some retirees, all of them laughing over some shared joke. The purple-haired web designer who'd become a regular was teaching Mrs. Henderson how to use Instagram. "Would you look at that?" Kelly said, sliding up beside her with a fresh pot of coffee. "Remember when you used to say mixing up the regulars would ruin the diner's atmosphere?" Rachel felt her cheeks warm. "Yeah, well, I was wrong about a lot of things." She watched as a suit-wearing woman helped a truck driver figure out the new digital payment system they'd installed. Turns out atmosphere isn't about keeping things the same. It's about letting them grow. The morning rush kept them busy, but it was a different kind of busy now. Instead of just going through the motions, Rachel found herself actually enjoying the little interactions that made up her day. She knew most customers' names now, not just the long-time regulars, but the new faces who'd become part of the diner's expanding family. Mike came out of his office, nodding approvingly at the full tables. The diner's business had actually improved since they'd started making everyone feel welcome. "Funny how that worked." "Rachel," he called out, "can you help train the new girl today? Show her how we do things here." She looked over at Jenny, the newest hire, barely 18 and nervous as could be. "Sure thing, Mike." As she walked over to the frightened teenager, Rachel couldn't help but think about how different this conversation would be from the training she used to give. "First thing you need to know," Rachel told Jenny as they stood by the coffee maker, "is that everyone who walks through that door deserves the same respect. Doesn't matter what they're wearing, how they look, or where they came from. This is their place too." Jenny nodded earnestly, scribbling notes in a tiny notebook. Rachel had to hide a smile, remembering how she'd once thought she knew everything there was to know about running a diner. Now she understood that the most important lessons had nothing to do with memorizing orders or balancing plates. The bell chimed, and Rachel looked up to see Monica and Jonathan walking in. They'd become semi-regulars over the months, stopping by every couple of weeks. Today they had their young daughter with them, a curly-haired tornado of energy who immediately charmed everyone in sight. "Let me show you how we greet customers," Rachel told Jenny, leading her over to their table. The warmth in her voice was genuine as she welcomed them, making sure their daughter had a booster seat and some crayons before taking their order. As they worked through the morning rush, Rachel guided Jenny through the practical aspects of the job, but she made sure to emphasize the human element too. How to read people's needs beyond their orders, how to make everyone feel valued, how to catch yourself when old biases tried to creep in. Sometimes, she explained during a quiet moment, the hardest customer to serve is the one who reminds you of your own prejudices. That's when you have to work extra hard to be fair. The day flew by in a blur of coffee refills, plate deliveries, and countless small interactions. Rachel watched Jenny grow more confident with each passing hour, treating every customer with the same cheerful enthusiasm. The kid was a natural, but more importantly, she was starting from a better place than Rachel had. Near the end of their shift, as they were restocking sugar packets, Jenny asked, "How do you remember everyone's preferences? There are so many regulars." Rachel thought about it. You know what? They're not just preferences to remember. They're people to know. That guy over there? He's working 2 jobs to put his kid through college. The woman by the window? She just started her own business. Everyone's got a story, and part of our job is to make them feel like their story matters. The sun was setting when they finally started closing up, painting the diner in warm golden light. Rachel looked around at the space she'd called home for so many years. The same 4 walls, the same checkered floor, but somehow everything was different. Or maybe she was the one who'd changed. As she hung up her apron, Rachel caught her reflection in the window. She saw someone who'd learned that growth doesn't stop, that every day brings new chances to be better, to do better. The diner had taught her that lesson, but so had every person who'd walked through its doors, especially the ones she'd once tried to keep out. "Same time tomorrow?" Jenny asked, pulling on her jacket. Rachel nodded, smiling. "Tomorrow and every day after. There's always something new to learn, even in an old place like this." She locked up, the familiar jingle of keys a comforting sound in the evening quiet. Diamond's diner stood silent now, waiting for another day. But Rachel knew that when those doors opened tomorrow, they'd truly be open to everyone. And that, she'd finally learned, was what made a place feel like home.
Disclaimer: this channel does not support or tolerate any form of discrimination, racism, prejudice, or violation of human rights. The stories presented here are original and created by the author with the aim of promoting reflection, awareness, and dialogue. All content is developed with respect for diversity and the dignity of all people.